Welcome to our ISAS seminar today on the future of democracy in Pakistan. We're very privileged to have Professor Asim Sajjad Akhtar today. Everything from direct military rule to the rise and fall of Imran Khan to the most recent controversial and contested elections held recently in February this year, questions around democracy, its principles, values, privileges, and processes in Pakistan have been a going concern. Foremost amongst these concerns, of course, is the role and influence of the security establishment. But there are other interrelated concerns as well. Issues of censorship, of shrinking political space for opposition and dissent, of growing inequality, of control over governance, particularly in areas of economic management and foreign and environmental policy, as well as questions around a shared, fulfilling and unifying vision of Pakistan and its future. But beyond Pakistan, we're confronted with broader questions as well. Is Pakistan's experience unique, or is it indicative of global trends? Are we in fact witnessing a decline in democratic values worldwide? So I'm eager to hear from Professor Asim. He's the author of the book Politics of Common Sense, State, Society and Culture in Pakistan, published by Cambridge University Press. And I hope that he can help us make some sense of what's been happening. So I think what we'll do is Professor Asim will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Imran, to the ISAS, some of who I've known for a long time. I don't get to see you all very often, but I'm glad to be back. And to the audience for joining us today. So Imran, I think, put it very succinctly, and that's sort of, I'm interested in probing the second half of his introduction more, because all too often it feels like when we think about Pakistan, of course, this is an Institute of South Asian Studies, so it's an opportunity also to think about these questions in the context of the region at large. And I would suggest that not just South Asia, but as Imran suggests, there's also something to be thought about what is happening around the world at large. And just to sneak peek, of course, is what's about to happen not just in India in June, but the upcoming presidential election in the United States, where one Donald Trump looks set to be back in power, quite possibly. And so that I'll start from there. I think in the 2010s, there was this perception, or not a perception, there was a wave of what, variously in the literature are called far-right populist leaders, demagogues in the mold of Trump. I would put Modi in there, Erdogan, and Imran Khan, and many more. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary. I mean, the list is long, and you could, depending on Giorgia Meloni in Italy, this Dutch guy who just won the election, although he didn't form the government. And the perception at the time, or some of the critical literature that emerged in political theory literature or political economy literature, saw this as, in a sense, the failure of the liberal center. So you have well-established sort of centrist, or what we call the liberal center. That could mean, the Democratic Party in the United States, to the Congress Party in India, to in Pakistan's case, sort of the entrenched bourgeois old guard, what I call the bourgeois old guard of the Muslim League and the People's Party. And because the liberal center fails, and I'll get to what I mean by failure, this opens up or paves the way for sort of this larger than life sort of figure, which of course the February 24 election in Pakistan is sort of in a sense magnified Imran's persona while sitting in jail. But as I said, not just Imran, many other larger than life figures as sort of these almost Messiah type saviors who will come in and sort of wipe away the old guard, which is variously these empty signifiers of, interminably corrupt, inefficient, unable to deliver, so on and so forth. Steal all our money and take it offshore to places like Singapore, and these figures then also were able, and part of the shameless plug, Imran just mentioned a book I wrote in 2018. The more recent book I've written is called The Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan. And one of the things that I sort of probe in this is the way in which the digital sphere has transformed the political. And so these larger than life individual figures have deployed the digital in ways that I think demands attention. So if you think about Modi in India, for instance, he's never done a press conference. Not once in 10 years has the Prime Minister of India sat in front of a room and been challenged, because he has the soapbox of Twitter, just like Trump did, and just like Imran does still have. And just to put this in context, the PTI is by far the most digitized party in Pakistan. It has millions of members that in the diaspora, like some of you, I know diehard PTI supporters here as well. But in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and of course within Pakistan itself. So there is something global to this story. It is not just a Pakistan-specific story. Now, whether you call it a sort of a backward step, or in some of the very mainstream political science literature, what is called backsliding, or whether you think about it in the frames that I do, either way, there's something that I think, first of all, just to get us started, just that this is, I'm keen to avoid thinking about Pakistan as some kind of unique basket case. Of course, it's no small mercy that other countries don't have an army like Pakistan does. So there are some things that are uniquely Pakistani, but just to get us started. So really what I'm interested in us thinking about is moving beyond Pakistani or the Pakistan story as a story of palace intrigues. There's Nawaz Sharif, and then there's the Bhuttos, and then there's Imran, and then there's this army chief, and then there's that army chief, and that is all too often, that over-determines the way in which we perceive how things are happening. So just to take a classic example, the general sort of almost like millenarian belief amongst supporters of the PTI is that, well, if nothing else, Imran is not corrupt. They're all corrupt, but he's not. And for me, that's besides the point. That's irrelevant. It's an irrelevance, because it doesn't really speak to some of the more significant structural sort of stories that I think need to be probed, and thinking about why a figure like Imran Khan commands the audience that he does. So I'll offer you, and as I said, shameless plug, it's all in my book, so please read it. And mind you, this was written before he was kicked out of power. And I would argue that most of what's in here is still relevant, even though at this point he hadn't had a fallout with the generals and so on. So there's three big structural, I think, foundational questions that I think, and now I'll sort of zone in more on South Asia, that I think demand our attention in trying to work through both this larger question of the future of democracy, and then how we think about what I said earlier about the failure of the liberal center and the repeated return of the strong man who's going to save us all. Right? The first is demography. These are things that we tend not to think about except in sort of a rosy picture version. But by that I mean two things. First of all, this is along with sub-Saharan Africa, this is the most populated region in the world. Of course, India is the bulk of that story. But you add Bangladesh and Pakistan, and I think even if you go west of Pakistan to Afghanistan, we're talking about 2 billion people, in fact more. And even more significantly, this is probably sub-Saharan Africa is the youngest, but South Asia is an extremely young population. So Pakistan's median age, which means if you take all of Pakistan's 250 million people and you pick the middle person, that person would be 23 years old. And it's a similar demographic profile for the rest of the region. Afghanistan is younger. And just to give you another example, Senegal just recently had an election. There's a different context. Senegal's median age is 19. So these are the world's two most populated regions, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. They're home to more than half of the world's people, in total about 4.5 billion. They will come to occupy a bigger chunk of the world's population. And they are all very young. And they're all very digitalized. Okay, these are some sort of broad stroke stories. And then the other thing that I want to add to that story in the South Asian case, which it happens when some big event happens and then suddenly we realize, oh, this is also something to pay attention to. But then usually it fades into the background, which is climate change. Okay, so some of you will remember, we tend not to, the time-space compression of our digital age means that we don't even remember what happened yesterday. But if we sort of have a deeper historical sense of our times, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater 18 months ago. 35 million Pakistanis were displaced from their homes. And you go across to the other end of the subcontinent, Bangladesh is perpetually dealing with flooding, cyclones. You go into the chunk of the subcontinent, which actually most of Pakistan shares the broader climatic conditions with, and we have extreme heat as our bigger long-term challenge. In fact, a statistic just to suggest to you that it's a double whammy. On the one hand, we're facing floods. And that is, just to get you thinking about this, is triggered largely by what we call permanent glacier melt. Pakistan is home to the three biggest mountain ranges in the world, the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush, and the Karakoram. And the Gilgit-Baltistan, which is the meeting point of all of these three mountain ranges, has the highest number of glaciers in the world outside of the polar regions. More than 7,000. And the way the water system, this is a short geology lesson, the way the water system in much of South Asia works is, in the summer months, the glaciers sort of have their climatic melt, which is what feeds the Indus River and feeds all of its tributaries all the way down to the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. Now that's how the cycle has worked for potentially even hundreds of thousands of years. Problem now is that there's permanent glacier melt. So it's not just seasonal melt, it is permanent. And so that is leading to floods in the short run. And in the long run, there's no more water. And in fact, if you go down to the delta, so in the coast of Sindh and Balochistan, the sea is now intruding upwards, if you can possibly imagine this anti-gravitational logic. Salt water is intruding upwards, almost 100 kilometers up now, near Kotri or Hyderabad. Often there's no water from Kotri barrage down to Karachi. So in the next 30 years, we're looking at Pakistan's total arable land of about 80 or sort of 78 million hectare feet becoming desert. 63 million or so will become desert. So just to recap, an extremely young population, highly connected, digitally connected, and subject to large-scale climatic and other impacts of warming that I don't see either anyone across the political spectrum even talking about, let alone aware or conscious of. Now, just more context. Please tell me when I'm starting to run out, because I could talk forever about this stuff. More context just to give us, and again, this is something that I think allows us to have a bit of a sort of sharp comparison to India. We were talking amongst ourselves over the last couple of nights that, you know, the Pakistan story is, oh, things are always terrible, and the India story is, oh, things are great. I don't buy that on either side of the spectrum. And this is how this sort of put that into context. So what I call a militarized post-colonial capitalism, which is the same across the subcontinent. In Pakistan's case, it may be fronted by the army, and it literally is fronted by the army, because the army is, you know, runs logistics and transport and fertilizer and cereal, and they do it all, right? In India's case, you know, it's split up between the Ambanis and the Tatas and the Birlas, right? In a sense, just to sort of put that into sharp relief. But it's still capitalism, and it still has very peculiar post-colonial characteristics. Let me just share some of those characteristics with you. It's had a huge population, massive urban sprawl. So rural peripheries are no longer able to absorb the mass young population in the agrarian sector. They move to these massive metropolitan zones, which could be Karachi, Faisalabad, Lahore, but it could just as well be Dhaka, Bombay, and Calcutta, right? And this is giving rise to what the famous American sociologist Mike Davis called a planet of slums. So, you know, Delhi and Lahore are exactly the same. People sleep on the pavements. People sleep in kachiyabadis, on nalas. And every once so often, in the name of beautification and anti-encroachment operations, they're bulldozed. And this is what Marx once called surplus populations. Populations that are not being absorbed in the classical sort of story of, you know, the dual economy of Arthur Lewis, where once the agrarian sector cannot absorb a laboring class, it moves to the city, and then an industrial sector will absorb it. But the industrial sector does not absorb it. And so we have this, in fact, I was reading an ILO report recently, just came out about India. 92% of India's workforce is informalized, 92%. Right? In Pakistan's case, we have 2.5 million people joining the workforce every year because of a huge young population. And the formal sector for over the last 4 years has on average generated 50,000 jobs a year. So you do the math. 2.45 million people are surplus just on a yearly basis. And some of you will have seen, and by the way, this is the same if you go across the subcontinent. Remember there was some maybe now some months ago, there was a ship that capsized off of the coast of Greece. Now on that ship, you know, you would think, you know, sort of a largely illiterate mass of rural migrants. No, on that ship were people who are highly educated, university educated. I teach at the best, so-called best public sector university in Pakistan. And I have MPhil students whose best hope of a job is being a Kareem driver. Right? And that's a very small segment of the population, highly educated. And so we have people, you know, trying to get out of the country by hook or crook, smuggle themselves across the border, get onto a ship. And so basically what I want to suggest to you is that the model of capitalist growth that, you know, you can call it India shining, but it still does not absorb this huge population because it's increasingly financialized. So for instance, as some of you will know, Pakistan's most successful businessman is a real estate mogul, Malik Riaz. Of course, Imran has been jailed in the case where he gave money to Malik Riaz for this so-called Al-Qadir University. And Malik Riaz, for those of you familiar with the geography of Lower Sindh, basically owns everything from When you get on the superhighway from Karachi from Surabgot, and you go 160 kilometers to Hyderabad, for about 80 kilometers, all of that is Beria town or DHA. And what happens with those big housing schemes, it allows, you know, investors, foreign sort of Pakistanis, to put money in and generate returns. But it's not like the old idea of industrial development, right? Where you're putting up a factory and you're also generating, you know, thousands of jobs. There's no jobs. In fact, it engenders dispossession, because there are indigenous villages, there are fishing communities, there are pastoral communities. So the story of large parts of the subcontinent behind this otherwise shiny malls and gated housing schemes, and, you know, offshoring with pharmaceuticals and software, is a large, huge, increasingly surplus laboring population that is simply unable to secure any kind of gainful employment. The last thing about this story is, however, at the same time, even as this is happening, the dominant ideological story, which for me, and this is a point of contention, you can argue, but for me is similar, or is propagated in not in any kind of distinct way between all of the mainstream parties. So the liberal center, and then the emergent sort of strongman. It could be the Pakistani military, it could be whoever in this, whichever political actor, is what I call an ideology of middle class aspiration. And this is very similar to the American dream story. You know, America has this sort of image of itself as the home of the free and the land of the brave, and anybody can show up and make it, but not everybody makes it, right? That's also an empirical fact. You know, America is still the most unequal country in the world. And so what we have in the story of middle class aspiration is that you can do the window shopping in the mall and imagine having a corner plot in Beria town and, you know, lease out a car through cheap credit from a commercial bank. But for instance, when COVID happened, we saw those images of millions of workers streaming back on foot. So it's a very volatile idea of middle classness, right? So this idea that you can sort of, your consumption levels can determine sort of some upward mobility into this somewhat vacuous idea of the middle class. But it's a volatile and perpetually subject to these shocks where you get pushed back down very rapidly. So inequality is growing, concentration of wealth. Statistics, some of you will have seen. India is now more unequal than at any time under the British. Top 1% of Indians now own about 40% of the wealth of that country. So it's a growth story, but it's a very unequal growth story. And Pakistan is certainly not better in that story. And as I said, it's no small mercy that India or Bangladesh or what have you, any other any other country who doesn't have an army that is fronting this. But that is, as Imran noted, that's sort of one aspect which is distinct, but there's so many other sort of aspects that I'm trying to get us to think about as certainly not that dissimilar. So this middle class aspiration is a big part of this. And this is where I will sort of take us to the production of Imran Khan. So, extremely young population, disaffected from the mainstream parties, right? And digitalized. So in 2011, Imran, who of course, as you know, has been in politics for many years before that, but was basically a non-entity. 2011, there's this huge big jalsa or big public rally in Minto Park in Lahore, and sort of Imran is suddenly now a big player. And, you know, I think any kind of critical self-awareness, even from people within the PTI, would be like, yeah, the military had a big part to play in that, right, in that launch. And of course, the military has always done this in Pakistan, right? One day, someone is a hero and the other day that person is corrupt. And then the next cycle, the person who was a corrupt chor is now brought back and is a hero. And then the courts will rule in your favor. And of course, the palace intrigues, some of you followed 6 judges, just wrote this letter, but that's all palace intrigues. Yeah, none of those judges are talking about this stuff. You follow me? And mind you, just to put that into context, a judge can be intimidated and harassed, and we should certainly care about that. But young people in peripheral regions like Balochistan have been not just intimidated and harassed, they've been disappeared for 20 years. No judge takes up that erosion of civil liberties or democracy. Yeah, it's not to minimize the fact that a judge is writing a letter, but it's just to say, well, why and when do we suddenly remember that there is a so-called rule of law and there are civil liberties to be sort of concerned with? So at the top echelons of, like I said, this militarized accumulation story, what we see with the rise of Imran Khan was sort of almost a surface level identification. Corrupt politicians, stealing all our money, no mention of all of this stuff. A lot of the standardized sort of, in a sense, narratives of Pakistan's history. Islam is in danger, we are surrounded by enemies, and the West, some cultural artifact of the West. So the West is not a cultural artifact. There's something known as once we peer into history or deeply, we'll find that it's called Western imperialism, and it's sustained by a systematic exploitation of resources. It's not just a cultural artifact. But when Imran came in and posited this story, a lot of the details were missing, a lot of the depth was missing. And so young people bought that story because the surface level phenomenon are correct. But if you just identify individuals as responsible for all of this, rather than sort of a deeper institutional or class analysis, then what happens, and that's what happened in Imran's case, when the palace intrigue starts to work against you, and again, just some specifics about that. There wasn't any rupture between Imran and the army until the army chief decided to change the DGISI. There wasn't rupture about the barrier towns. There wasn't rupture about, a lack of industrial policy. There wasn't rupture about policy in Afghanistan. Until what's his name? General Faiz Hamid was posted out of the ISI, everything was, you'll remember, in fact, for many years, there was this great celebration that the civil and military leadership are on the same page. The same page was this idiom that was circulated in Pakistan between 2018 and 2022 ad nauseum. And at that time, the same civil liberties that we see being eroded now, it could be of judges, it could be of missing persons, it could be of opposition politicians, it was just role reversal. And that is coming from someone who, whether as an academic or someone who's politically active, myself and many other acquaintances faced a lot of very serious heat at that time. So it's just about which, in Pakistan's case, which foot the boot is on. And then if you change the foot, the boot is still the boot. And that's what I'm saying. So beyond the palace intrigues, it's important to sort of get a sense of what are the deeper, sort of in some sense, the underlying dynamics that don't really change across these. So the production or Imran's sort of popularity and appeal is precisely in the fact that there's an identification of the surface level phenomena without necessarily sort of a deeper interrogation. And again, shameless plug, this is what I call the politics of fear and desire. So the combination of fear, you stoke fear against some other, and then you offer yourself as the embodiment of how to meet people's middle class aspirations. That as a young person, you can make it. You follow me, and I will lead you to the promised land. You come out on the streets, and we will together end slavery, which for a long time was just slavery of the West and the politicians. And then later on it was discovered, well, actually, we're also slaves of the generals. But anyone with a deeper interrogation of the story would have known that we were slaves of the generals even then, long before the rupture happened. But it is important. The point I want to make is that someone like me, I don't have to be a supporter of Imran Khan to understand the appeal, right? To understand where and how that narrative generates so much traction amongst, as I said, a young population, digitalized. And it's important to understand, it can be a Modi, it can be Imran, it can be Trump. The digital apparatus is huge to their appeal. It is a massive part. In fact, the other parties cannot compete. They realize this far too late in the game. The Congress realized this far too late in the game. The only competitor in that sense, in the Indian context, would be Karjiwal, right, who has this sort of like appeal to a young sort of demographic as well. But generally speaking, these individual sort of messiahs are able and have been able to dominate the digital sphere. And I think that's very important. So why is this appealing? What it does, but what it doesn't do, I think is also important. And that brings us back to where we started. I think the liberal centers will continue to generate will continue to pave the way. And on a very more abstract theory note, Alberto Toscano has just written a book called Late Fascism. And it's interesting, when we talk about fascism, and I agree with this generally, we think, oh, Italy and Germany in the 1930s. And of course, we're not in the 1930s, neither are Italy and Germany in the 1930s, nor is the rest of the world in the 1930s. But the fact that the term is being used in contemporary political theory, I think should tell us something. And what Toscano is basically tells us in this book is that it is these underlying dynamics of accumulation, of growth, of sort of, in a sense, environmental collapse, that can generate two kinds of narratives. One can be to say, okay, there's a systematic economic and political story, and we need to look for, identify what that is, and then think about some kind of holistic framework for transcending that sort of dominant political and economic system. The other is you can say, well, for instance, if you're in North America or Western Europe, you could say, well, we are suffering, as in we being the white people, are suffering because of the immigrants. Yeah? You can sort of racialize the story. Okay? If you're in South Asia, you could say, well, we, the young, aspiring, middle-class subject who wants to be free of this corrupt political elite, is suffering because of a combination of this elite, also the West, sort of these, what in the literature on populism would be called empty signifiers. So it signifies something, but it's somewhat empty. The content is missing. And I think that is what we see around the world. It's no small wonder that Trump is, Trump is implicated in hundreds of cases, right? He's on criminal charges, but his popularity won't go away. In fact, the more he can play the victim and say, see, I'm an outsider. I'm a representative of the common American, by which he means some kind of racialized notion. But if you take that sort of prototypical example and you say, what's happening in India with democracy, or what's happening in Pakistan with democracy, there are certain distinct elements to all of these stories. And there's no question, and I don't need to, none of you probably would need to be convinced that Pakistan story, no matter how far back you go, the military is front and center. One of the good things about what has happened with the PTI and Imran Khan is that what people like myself have been trying to even convince my own family about for 25 years. Now they're like, oh, now we see it. Okay, yeah, the army, really, yeah, we see it. But I think what I would urge all of us to do is to say it's not just about Imran Khan. It's about, if it's not Imran Khan, we could go in another cycle of palace intrigues. And if these underlying structural dynamics remain misidentified or absent, then the longer term story, I think, becomes even more dystopic. And it is, 1/3 of a country underwater, 35 million people displaced. That's dystopic. And that is, unfortunately, I think, what South Asia and large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, with these hugely young populations, with an economic model that certainly represents some kind of growth, but I'm not convinced that it's certainly not very, what we would call, even mainstream, would be called inclusive or egalitarian by any stretch of the imagination. So I'll leave it there, and I'm assuming there will be, and I'm hoping there will be questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think this is the largest audience I've seen for an ISAS. Yeah, in the boardroom. You've covered so much here and connected it so elegantly. But I'm going to hold off from my questions and go to the audience and try and cover as many as we can. If you can just identify yourself and just ask the question and sort of just get straight to the question if possible. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm from the public. I have no background in Asian studies. I don't even have a degree.
Okay.
I want to ask, I went to a temple. Everything we see is through imagination turned into reality, whether it's a chair, whether it's a table, whether it's a country, whether it's a concept, whether it's ideas, whether it's culture, whether it's religion, all are imagination turned into reality. Now that we are in this reality, dystopic world, climate change, democracy under siege, how can we turn all this into a better world? To me, democracy is overrated. Democracy is not the least worst political system. It is only better than tyranny. Plato and Aristotle said that philosopher king and aristocracy they are better than democracy. Democracy is only better than tyranny, that's all. The West spin it that is best of all, or the least worst. Even our law minister, Samuga, also said that the democracy is the least worst. So I noticed you mentioned a lot of problems in South Asia, sub-Saharan Africa. I noticed that there's no solution offered. No offered solution. Previously, there were 4 great kings, heavenly kings: Jesus, Buddha, Socrates, Confucius. All of them offered solutions. Now they don't work, but we still have remnants of them that's supposed to work.
We'll just thank you so much. So
just a little bit more. And then there were 4 saviors: Hitler, Mao Zedong.
I think we'll just have to stop there, and we can maybe get a response from us.
And Nelson Mandela and Gandhi. These 4 different saviors, different effects. So my question is, what solution you offer?
Got it. I hear you.
And how do we identify whether a savior is Jesus or Hitler in disguise?
Got it.
Got a question.
Thank you. Do you want me to do it one by one? Yeah.
I think just for the moment we can.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I mean, I think you're right at some broad sort of level of abstraction, and I'm certainly not I'm much too far on the left to be a fan of liberal democracy and its hypocrisies, or liberal imperialism and its hypocrisies. I think that for me, the sort of, and you called on a long tradition of particularly Western philosophy and maybe a little bit of Eastern philosophy there when you mentioned Buddha and Gandhi. But I think for me, the question is how we think about democracy, right? So if I sort of just sort of summarize what you're saying in the present context, I would say democracy, largely under the shell of contemporary capitalism, is really captured by big interest groups. And even when we talk about the digital and social media, if you look at sort of the big social media platforms, the way in which algorithms work, and the way in which platforms generate sort of a certain kind of ideology or certain kind of temporality, that would be the way to refract some of what you're saying. The solution follows a critical analysis of this. Like this is something that I hear often when people are like, well, tell me how to fix it. Well, first we have to have a framework to understand what's happening. As I said earlier, I think what I'm interested in being able to say is I want to know why young people are why there's so much, why Imran is so appealing to them. Why is Modi so popular? Why is Trump still able to command that kind of audience? That, I think, is the first step to a solution. There is no magic wand solution. Unfortunately, there isn't. I think there is a crisis of representative, as I said, democracy in general around the world. But I also think the second thing I would say is also worth taking recourse to history. Right? This has happened again and again. If you go back 100 years, in Italy and Germany, the center was failing. Mussolini and Hitler came to power through the ballot box, don't forget. Yeah? So this is something for us to think about deeply, critically. It's not just the time-space compression is a real problem. We sort of tend to think, oh, well, this is something that's just happening now. No, it's not. There's a longer tradition. That then is what you're saying. There's a long, even much further longer tradition. And so there's certainly like conceptual questions to be asked. For me, the solution starts with a critical understanding of what is happening now and putting it into some kind of historical context. The rest, I'm not sure you're too interested in hearing about because that would take you much too far to the left for you to be that interested in.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other? Yes, sir, at the back.
I'm a member of the public. It's not related, but I don't need that. So I have a question. Right?
So if you could get straight to the question, please.
Sorry?
If you could get straight to the question.
I am getting straight.
Thank you.
So the question is, in our post-separation from East Pakistan and Bangladesh history, if you look at the 53, 54 years, we've always blamed the politician for the corruption that is in the system. However, if you look at the history, and most people don't look at the history, almost 40% of those years were ruled by direct army, and others were hybrid. 2 years of Benazir, Yet, when a political party or a politician is in bed with the army, everything is fine. The moment they step out of it, everything is wrong. My question is this the political weakness in the political party, politicians, that they can't get together after they're out, create a revolt, understand that this is the problem? Or the population just doesn't get it because the big population still finds army as the messiah? Where is that coming from and why can't we get rid of that?
Great question. I mean, first of all, it has to do with the sort of what, again, just to draw on some theorists, Althusser would call ideological apparatuses, or what Gramsci would call hegemonic apparatuses. So from a young age in Pakistan, and frankly, you don't even have to be in Pakistan, you can be part of the diaspora. I grew up as part of the diaspora. I thought all of this stuff. So, if there's something unique about Pakistan, distinct. It's very, if you don't mind me saying, it's a very sort of self-perception similar to Israel. Okay, we are unique in the world. And we are besieged by enemies. And we are taught this in school. Our media parrots this narrative. The army, of course, wants all of this to happen because then it becomes the perpetual savior. of Islam and so on. And some of you, I don't know if you, well, many of you are older than me, so you might remember, this is Habib Jalib had a very famous poem called Khatre mein Islam nahi. Right? So he had, and it was like, khatra hai zardaron se, mazhab ke thekedaron se, vagara, vagara, vagara. But the point is that this is an old story and it's reproduced. And Bhutto, and then of course most famously Zia-ul-Haq, actually created something called Pakistan Studies after Bangladesh came into existence. Why? To reinforce this idea that it, which by the way, very interestingly, is what Modi is now doing in India, right? That sort of Pakistan ki pehli eent, so just to translate, Pakistan's first sort of foundation stone was set in 712 when Muhammad bin Qasim came and conquered Sindh. I mean, that's a joke. Sorry, as a historian, that's a joke. It's ridiculous. But large segments of the population are taught this. Then you add to that we also have a colonial inheritance. So the colonial inheritance was that politics is bad. Administrators are good, politics is bad. Efficient administrators is what you want. An efficient civil service is what you want. And this is true across the subcontinent. There's a colonial inheritance we all share. But politicians are troublemakers, right? Now, in India's case, the early India was an India in which, Nehru and Gandhi's India, where, you celebrated civil disobedience. You sort of challenged the idea of this sort of mythical rule of law. No, the law should be broken if the law enslaves you, but not in Pakistan. That had something to do with Jinnah and his constitutionalism. Also had something to do with the lack of a mass movement. There's many sort of distinct features. But what I'm trying to say is that a lot of this history is not probed, right? There's a singular notion of history. The media propagates it, the educational system propagates it, and then it's reproduced over time. Just to sort of then put a spanner in the works, the real question is, this is always a question for people like myself is, for instance, in 2007, when Musharraf was being booted out, and he was booted out, right? People were on the streets. There was a similar anti-military sentiment. In fact, some of you may know this better. Probably the single greatest point of anti-military sentiment in Pakistan was in 71. There was a judicial commission, the Hamoud Rahman Commission. If you read it, it's shocking what the serving judges are saying about ye jang kaise ladenge. I don't even want to get into what they are doing. But what happens then, a cycle completes itself, and then 4 or 5 years later, they're back as the saviors. And so certainly that has something to do with the way that the political class sort of takes turns. But for me, again, that would narrow down the story to a story of a small elite. What I'm interested in understanding is, for instance, this time, if there's a young population that, whatever the reason may be, after Imran has been booted, has now started to say, oh, actually, it's the army that's pulling all the strings. But will they look beyond the fact that, well, if Faiz Hamid was the army chief, then we wouldn't be saying this. It's the fact that Asim Munir became the army chief, which unfortunately, that's what most of social media suggests. Asim Munir bura hai. But that's besides the point. The point is the economic and political structure. The fact that you have this national narrative of being besieged by any. By the way, just a small digression. I mean, look at the cruel irony. In August 2021, when the Americans departed Afghanistan, which, by the way, Imran at the time, as prime minister, said they've broken the shackles of slavery. Not the best, not a great thing to say, because it was the Taliban coming back into power. This was celebrated in official circles in Pakistan. We have a friendly government, and lo and behold, people like us who are saying, no, this is going to end badly. Oh, it's ending badly. It's only 2.5 years later. The Taliban are in Pakistan. There's all sorts of the same story is repeating itself. So the reason why, as you rightfully point out, that we go in these cycles is because there's moments of rupture. That rupture remains limited to palace intrigues. And then even if there is a popular shared perception that, okay, wait, hold on, actually, it's not just the politicians, there's something else. It still remains limited to individual generals or to perhaps who's in power and who's not. It doesn't go to, all of the story that I laid out for you, demography, climate change. I didn't even have time today to talk about the IMF. It drives me a bit batty, if I'm honest with you. It drives me a bit crazy that we have gone to the IMF 20 odd times since 1988. There you go. Someone far more educated than me on this. 20 odd times. And every time we go, and we have sort of this self-flagellation attitude about it. Oh, well, our politicians are corrupt. That's why. Well, the IMF also has a bit of an agenda. Sorry, thank you very much. The IMF is not some blameless, just really, debt is a global phenomenon. Bangladesh, Imran will know much better about this. Bangladesh, which is like the poster child of globalization and garments export, went to the IMF for the first time in a decade last year. Because these globalized logics of production and consumption, as I said, are very volatile. COVID happened and Bangladesh success story, literally, like the floor falls out for a bit. Or COVID happened, and as I said, in India, we saw like how that massive reverse migration. So these are the sorts of things that don't happen when these moments of rupture happen. And then, people, well, not like myself, but I actually teach at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies. And so you will be surprised how offended they are that someone like me teaches in an institution like that. And how concerned they are and how much effort they make to get people like me booted. Because God forbid that official ideology or official history is actually challenged. And people start thinking beyond just these palace intrigues. So it's a great question. And as I said, the follow-up question is, when you have moments like what we see today, how do you deepen it? How do you sort of go beyond the surface phenomena? And for that, of course, you need, genuine lefties like myself to be, you need the diaspora to stop sending money to Imran and send money to people like us.
Thank you so much, Asim. Actually, my question was going to be on the IMF and the austerity measures and those kinds of things, but I'll hold off on that. Maybe if we can take, we've got about 20 minutes, so maybe if we could take 2 questions at a time, please.
My question is a small one. Any surety that there will be no more military rule in Pakistan?
Any other?
When will that happen, right?
Karthik, yes.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Karthik. I'm a fellow here at the Institute. I don't work on Pakistan, just a disclaimer. Just a couple of points. I do read a lot about what's happening, and just a couple of points on some of the things I've read. The first is the role of the United States. Clearly part of the tussles between Imran and the military deals with the US and the role of the US within Pakistani state, the Pakistani political economy, and the kinds of strains of anti-Americanism that have been introduced and injected into the Pakistani polity. What is the state of that now? How much if dealing with the American question can help Pakistani politics resolve and deal with the other issues that exist today? And second, you brought a lot about climate change, and I do work on climate policies in the region. And I can't think of a more, if you look at the Pakistani political economy, right? You mentioned the militarized post-colonial capitalism. I can't think of a structure that is more ill-equipped to deal with a challenge like climate change than is what we have in Pakistan and possibly some of the other countries in South and maybe even Southeast Asia, right? You need to think about what are the kind of decentralized solutions that exist. You need states and provinces and other subnational actors being much more actively involved. You need firms becoming a big part of the solution now. And mitigation and adaptation really is working in multiple levers and directions across a lot of these countries. So you have to fundamentally restructure the structure of Pakistani political economy if we're going to even begin to think about addressing or dealing with a challenge like climate change now and going forward. So how do you think about that now? And yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think, should I get to it?
I think someone over there as well.
Question? No, that's okay. Maybe we'll take the three.
You mentioned briefly the situation in Balochistan and enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. And I was curious to hear your thoughts about the latest kind of upsurge in the resistance movement from November to present that's kind of been happening in Pakistan. And you've talked a lot about the role of social media and digitization as well. And it seems to me that with the use of social media, the information black hole that was Balochistan is now kind of maybe moving into a phase where their suffering is becoming more visible, and what your thoughts were on whether this latest movement is bringing on maybe a shift in the status quo of Balochistan, or any other thoughts. Thank you.
Should I get to it?
Yes. So the first question is will there ever be, can we say there will never be military coups again? Unfortunately not, you cannot. I don't think it's ever possible. But I think what's interesting from the question in the back is that they, of course, since 2008, they really haven't bothered. Right? So this notion of hybrid rule, it only just came into existence recently. It became popular terminology recently, but really that's what it's always been. Always. And, many years ago when there wasn't this level of academic, even let alone public disclosure about the military's power in Pakistan. Hassan Askari Rizvi wrote about this in the 1980s, which then Aisha Siddiqa took up, and others, of course, have now taken this up. That basically it's, and this was interestingly, this was Ayub Khan's, one of Ayub Khan's, or Yahya Khan's actually ISPR guy, name was Colonel Sher Ali. He basically had a theory about this. Jaise generalon ki theories hoti hain. Ke, we stay out of the limelight and let everybody else take the heat. But we ensure that our budgetary outlays are guaranteed, which means we have to keep propagating the idea of being besieged and Islam in danger. What has changed in recent times, of course, since the 80s with Ziaul Haq and the DHAs and their expansion of corporate empire, is that they need to be more interventionist. They're more visible, right? And that has become even more and more disclosure about this. But they still have not had to intervene and to take the reins of government. And now, I don't know if any of you follow this, but you should. I'm sure you do. Many of you are associated with the business world. The Special Investment Facilitation Council is the next level. So under the chairmanship of the army chief, I've never seen anything like this. An investment facility for predominantly, he's banking on the Chinese and the Gulf, which will take me to the America question, right? And it's called the SIFC. It was set up under the caretaker government. The caretaker government's gone. An elected government is in office. And 2 to 3 days ago, the army chief chaired a meeting of the SIFC in which they said, well, now we're going to draft education policy. Right? So they've developed this method which I'm not sure is really the Sher Ali formula, because they're so prominent and they're sort of putting their noses into everything. But either way, they haven't felt the need to take over the reins of government directly. But can that happen? Certainly it can happen. I would never rule it out, because there's only one force that can save that country, and you know who it is. The other questions, which were really great questions, thanks. I mean, I think that the role of the US is an interesting one, because I don't think anti-Americanism, or sort of, even if I was to put it differently, an anti-imperialist sentiment is new to Pakistan. It's not. It's always been there, but it's become very culturalized. It's become absent this story. So for instance, it was America that funded the Pakistani military's operations under the guise of the War on Terror. Between 2002 and 2012, in bilateral military aid, Pakistan got $12 billion. That's just military aid. Then there's the IMF, which is, or the bank, which are essentially, excuse me if anybody's offended by this, but American-controlled institutions that offer aid, or they give you glowing economic reports if Washington's on your side or Tokyo's on your side or what have you. Now, in contrast to this, the Gulf and China have emerged as also now patrons, right? China with CPEC, Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia, with staggered oil payments, and they always roll over the oil payments. And then the Gulf is also now, by the way, the single biggest source of remittances. It's interesting, Pakistan's biggest foreign earnings are not textiles, are remittances. Our biggest export is labor. So America is no longer the exalted status of being the only patron in town. But what America represents, if you sort of broaden that story, is that we still fundamentally, the logic of foreign relations is how to generate geostrategic rents. Whether you do it in the name of the SIFC or you do it in the name of the war on terror or whatever. And whether under Ziaul Haq and Ayub Khan it was about anti-communism, that we will be the bulwark against the communists. Interestingly, of course, going back to the ideology story, nobody really bothers to think about the fact that Pakistan's new best friend China is also communist. No, that's an inconvenient sort of mismatch in the stories that people know. I probe this a lot, and of course, people tend to get very confused when they have to think about this. That, well, we supported jihad against the communists in Afghanistan, but the Chinese are also our friends, but it's a different matter. The point is that the America story, I think, if you put it into context, what it tells us that we're still looking for rents. And the IMF being a big one. Now we have, and I believe I just found out, someone who's another associate, like Shaukat Aziz had an association with Singapore, another finance minister with an association with Singapore, has just announced, to my horror, that Pakistan is looking for an extended facility with the IMF. So let's just deepen our reliance. Mind you, and I'm sure you're going to come to this, from fiscal year 23, which started in July, to fiscal year 26, we have to pay back $75 billion. And the logic is, well, let's take more. So we can pay, and of course, as you know, basic lesson of international finance is that you never pay back the principal. You're just taking more loans to sort of chalk off some of the interest payments. So the only difference in the America story and the China or the Gulf story, the China story in particular, is that America always generally gives money to the military. China gives money for roads and bridges. But as I said, I am able to understand why this anti-American sentiment exists, right? Because it is true. America does, sort of, the American ambassador in at the time, Karachi, was the only person who knew about the coup in 1958. Right? So whether it happened with Imran is a different matter, about the cipher and all of this. This is a big part of the narrative. But again, that surface phenomenon, there's a truth to it, right? That they sort of, they get you into this trap of dependency, you fight their wars, and then they leave. And that is something that I think has great traction because it certainly doesn't just scratch the surface. The second question, which I think is a more significant question, is you're absolutely correct. We are not equipped, other than some of the sort of terminology that you like. Now you have a segment of sort of a donor-funded civil society that is familiar with this terminology, adaptation and mitigation. But the new big NGO game in Pakistan is about how carbon credits, and but it's very surface level. So you have this very, it's one of those classic things. You talk about poverty reduction, so people want to give you cash transfer safety nets. They don't actually question, well, why are so many people falling into poverty in the first place? One of those sorts of things, right? So the climate change story is limited to let's address its impacts, without thinking about, so just again, another digression. The 2022 floods, yes, we had abnormal amounts of rain, and yes, the river system was flooded from some of the glacier melt. But one of the biggest problems and the biggest immediate triggers of why so many people were inundated was bad infrastructure. A lot of mega water projects were blocking natural drains, right? And so, natural waterways that would drain water were blocked, and so they completely flooded inundated far bigger areas. So nobody talks about the developmental model. Everybody's saying, okay, let's sort of do something about how to mitigate, let's say. So yes, there's no level of analysis. In fact, interestingly, when the new cabinet took oath, there wasn't even a minister of climate change. The two ministries where they didn't even give a portfolio were health and climate change. Because who cares about those two? Let's just do it all through the SIFCs, basically, seems to be the motto. And the last question, look, I think this insurgency in Balochistan is now 20 years old. And it's gone through very many, it's like a sine curve. Its geographical sort of center has shifted from northeast Balochistan and the old entrenched sort of tribal leaders like the Buktis and the Maris and the Mengals to southern Balochistan and the coastal regions, which are very different social structure. They're not tribal, a lot of educated young people, so they use social media. All of these things are correct. It's still long odds for a movement of that nature to be able to, in a world where, do we need to look any further than what's happening in Palestine to understand that, you even say, well, there's a historic injustice, and they're like, oh, you support Hamas? So that sort of captures the way the Balochistan question is imagined and thought through, right? It's just reduced to that. So it's certainly, again, the question would be, why do so many young people, young Baloch they're so brutalized, which is why then militancy becomes in some ways the only thing that they can choose. But do I see a way out of it, that imbroglio? No, I don't, because it's still it's still an isolated movement in a sense. It certainly has some support, as you say, with broader segments of the population, especially because of social media, but I don't see that as offering a way out. I see a cycle of brutalization, which then sort of repeats itself. What is different, and this is certainly something, it seems to me, you follow, is a very, I think, something, I wouldn't say to be celebrated, but something to be noted, that the leadership of the Baloch nationalist movement now has passed to women, which is quite unprecedented. It so happens that many of these young women are daughters and of men who were picked up and disappeared. And if you're a young Baloch educated person in Pakistan, and you even have a brain, you're in danger of being picked up and disappeared. So it's almost by process of elimination that women have taken the mantle, because there's less risk associated. Well, that's still a very relative term, less risk. It's still very risky. But nevertheless, I mean, that again will give it more traction, more visibility. But it is still, I still see this cycle of violence that is propagated by the state as something that is not immediately, I don't see any breaking out of it as such, in the short term at least.
Thank you so much, Asim. So we started 5 minutes late, so we'll, if you will afford me the liberty, we'll keep going for a little bit longer. So we've got about eight or so minutes. Any other questions in the audience? Okay. So maybe I can ask you a question.
Please do.
So I think, you touched on, you really did such a wonderful job in putting together the big picture of things, the structural elements. You sort of spoke about getting us to think about beyond palace intrigues. And you mentioned, I wanted to probe a little bit more about the IMF agenda that you mentioned. So we already read lots of things about, the rising cost of living, inflation, falling exchange rates in Pakistan. What do you think is the impact of, the economic restructuring programs or the austerity programs that it's going to have on, the ordinary Pakistani?
Yeah, I think if you look at just the last couple of years, inflation in Pakistan has been a weekly average of 40%. That's for 2 years now. That's astonishing. If you just think about that in terms of what it means. It is affected not just in the everyday cost of basic commodities, but also in the systematic repeal of subsidies for basic amenities. Gas prices have tripled. Electricity prices have quadrupled. Petrol prices fluctuate a bit more, but have also continued to rise. If you look at the curve, it is the gradient is clear. That's going to happen more. And of course, the reason for that is that the IMF talks growth and stabilization, but basically always wants to ensure that its creditors get paid back. Doesn't care how. It'll say a lot of stuff about the things that you should ostensibly do, which generally are like, well, sell all of your bad assets and repeal subsidies, which in many cases, I think, is a very one-size-fits-all. We know this in the critical literature, what was once called the Washington Consensus. One-size-fits-all set of policies which have historically contracted economies, have not generated jobs. Pakistan is a great example. And then, of course, because Pakistan has such a, which, by the way, the rest of South Asia is not great, tax to GDP ratio. It's not as if our taxation is terrible compared to the rest of South Asia. But the reason why subsidies are repealed and why all of these indirect taxes are lodged is because there's no political will to tax the rich. And certainly not the khaki rich, because they're the saviors and et cetera, right? And all of that story. I could say that ad nauseum. But also not, the real estate is a classic example. Real estate, the last time I wrote a paper on this, and this will have exponentially increased 4 years ago, real estate was, the value added gains in real estate was 700 billion rupees a month. We taxed about 0.1% of that. So, I mean, it's frankly a joke. There is no tax. And so you tax the poor. It's all regressive. You just add sales tax on everything that people have to buy. And that's the standard method. Like I said, all of them do it. Imran did it. Nawaz Sharif's done it. The Bhuttos have done it. It doesn't change. It's not like that set of economic policies, whether the prescriptions that come from the fund or the government in power that's doing it has actually ever changes. It's not changed. It's just, as I said, 88, 22 programs. It's the same. Now they're about to, in fact, just to give you one example of this, which is why I think the IMF or the bank are certainly part of this problem. 1995, a very celebrated policy instrument backed by the World Bank, in fact, pushed by the World Bank, was called the independent power producers, Pakistan's power sector, electricity generation. And they said, well, Pakistan, like the standard sort of ideological story, the state is bad, the market is good, so sell all of the assets. And they said, well, electricity is, the state sector wastes all the electricity, power transmission is terrible, and so on and so forth. So they said, let's split up the power sector into production and distribution. Basically, production of power, so very vis-a-vis, and separate it from the distribution of power. So the distribution was left to the government. So what was called VAPTA back in the day, the Water and Power Development Authority, was broken up into a series of geographically clustered electricity supply corporations. So now you have IESCO in Islamabad, LESCO in Lahore, Karachi Electricity Supply Corporation in Karachi, etc., etc., etc. But power production has been privatized. It's been 30 years. It is an absolute scandal what the agreements that took place at the time. They gave sovereign guarantees to many, these are all private producers. The bank got sovereign guarantees from the government of Pakistan that they'll all be paid in dollars. So now what we have is a circular debt problem. And Pakistan doesn't have a capacity problem. This is a misnomer. People have always thought that Pakistan's problem, we don't produce enough electricity. No, it's not true. There's enough electricity on the grid to meet everyone's needs. They just can't pay the IPPs. So every once in a while, they can't pay off the IPPs because who are being paid in dollars at fixed exchange rates. And when the government doesn't have money, the IPPs just produce less than their full capacity. And then there's what we call load shedding, which of course the rich get around by setting up generators and so on and so forth. But the poor, so for instance, people in Kachi Abadis and squatter settlements, right, running one fan and one light bulb get bills of 30 to 40,000 rupees a month. It's a scandal. It's an utter scandal. And I refuse to acknowledge that the IMF is somehow just some innocent bystander. And it's just the corrupt politicians, doing all the business, you see? So I expect more of this. They're about to sell PIA. And PIA, mind you, they don't really care about PIA. They care about Roosevelt Hotel in New York. They care about assets, right, that are worth tens of millions of dollars. That's what it means to sell PIA, right? They're now going to privatize also the electricity distribution companies. So it's now production and distribution, both will be privatized. We'll be at the mercy of the free market, whatever the heck that is. Never known any market to be free. And they will say, well, this is necessary because structural reform is necessary. Nobody talks about land reform. That's also structural reform. Nobody talks about, corporate gains tax. That's also structural reform. God forbid nobody talks about cutting military companies down to size. Military companies get massive hidden subsidies. So the military budget is what you see on the surface is every year there's a budget. They get 25% of the budget. Then there's military pensions, which are not budgeted in the military budget. They show up in the civilian head. So that's looks like it's bloody civilians doing it. And then there's hidden subsidies, which are foregoing gas and electricity. So the Askaris, the DHAs, the Fauji foundations, the army welfare trusts, etc., etc. It says so many I can't even remember. They don't pay gas and electricity bills. Or, someone files a phone call to Chairman IESCO and they get it waived or they get it put off. And all of this is happening under the guise of structural reform, or not happening, is what I wanted to say. So I don't see it changing, right? Because the domestic political economy is entrenched. The donor community also operates according to geopolitical winds. So if the IMF is willing to give you a loan, they'll say the same thing, and we will have the same solutions, and we will keep going in cycles. The only thing I will say is I have no idea how the kind of debt repayment burdens that we now face. This past 2023, the debt servicing head in the official budget was 100% of current expenditures, just debt service, just this past year. And that is in a year where we have paid less. We paid, I think, 8 billion. And in the next 3 years, we are 25 billion per year. So I don't see any way out, no matter how many more extended facilities the IMF gives us, until there is a domestic sort of constituency which talks about some substantial redistribution of wealth. That's the only way out. And mind you, the other thing I would say, I didn't have a chance to talk about it today, some kind of peace dividend for South Asia. Some kind of like, make peace with your neighbors. Stop selling hawkish nationalism right before election time, which everybody does, right? That then applies to talking about climate change as a regional issue, a future for 2 billion young people, and that, well, that's, as I said, that's part of a left imaginary that I would have preferred to speak about today. But once you start sending me some money, then we can do that.
Okay, so I think we have to wrap up. We've gone a few minutes over time, but please big thank you to our speaker. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it in the corridors, and you'll get lots more questions. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Imran.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks for making time.